come to the second presentation of Hermetic America and bring ourselves to an awareness of where we are physically at the time, mid-April of 2008. And then in that awareness, let's focus our minds that we're taking a look at something which is vast and new, so that it does not register in the mind phenomenally yet, but can only register nominally, which requires something more than the existential awareness, something more than the mental focus. It requires a vision, a visionary amplitude. And while the classic frame of reference was for 4,000 years thought, word, and deed, the mental structure of thought, the mythic horizon process of language, and the deeds of our physicality in an existential realm where time and space are integral. That is this world. What is of the universe larger than this world, yet can be in this world, is the capacity to vision. And that visioning is also not a form, it is a process, but it is a process that is a field, the field of vision. When we speak of a frame of reference, if we include vision, we include something that is larger than just thought, word, and deed. It's others' thoughts, words, and deeds, and also the fact that there are others who can step outside of the world's frame of reference in a visionary way and constellate a different quality of themselves. That quality is the personality that is able to come back into the frame of reference of thought, word, and deed, and to change it, to make something happen. So that when that occurs, what happens is that the language changes. It gains a wider syntax, it gains a more complicated grammar, it enlarges its vocabulary, and it shows us that we must speak in a different way, that the old mythos, the mythic way of telling stories, has to transform. And when there's a personality, the language transforms so that it can no longer fit into a thought structure exclusively, which is called a rhetoric, and must now seek for a different kind of a language, which is a poetic. That shows then that the person who has their personality functioning so that vision is included in thought, word, and deed, has transformed the language so that the language is no longer based upon ritual exclusively. The language now is referential to something outside of the world's frame of reference. So we say of the person that they are not just body and mind, but they are also now spirit. Body, mind, and spirit transforms thought, word, and deed, so that deed, words, and thought now are expanded and you have something more to work with. You have the phenomenon of your body. You have the phenomenon of your mind. But you have something which is not phenomenal, which is your spirit person. This now brings into play a different triad, a different triplicate, a thrice greatest quality that includes spirit that can transform everything in the world. The apex of that in classical antiquity was the Hermetica, the Hermetic writings, that were constellated roughly between 90 and 160 AD. Most of them were written between 90 and 110 AD in Alexandria. And they were the constellation of something that was so resonantly powerful that the transforms continued to occur, not just in the visionary field because of living spiritual persons, changing, transforming the world that they had, but that transforming, because it had an extra dimensional amperage, continued to function in another flow that was not the mythic flow of experience, but was the historical flow of experience. And while the mythic flow is a storyline, beginning, middle, and end, because it's integral, history is kaleidoscopic because it's differential. So that now you have something which is extraordinary, summed up beautifully just a couple of decades ago, publication from the University of Virginia at Williamsburg and the University of North Carolina Press at Chapel Hill. They published this together. Dwight Bozeman, 1988. To live ancient lives. The primitivist dimension in Puritanism. Now we're at a very interesting historical cusp. The Puritans come into play exactly at the historical threshold where the Renaissance reaches a hiatus, an intervaling, and immediately what rises, displacing it more and more, is the Puritan ethos, Puritanism. The closeout of the Renaissance happened about 1613. The rise of Puritanism happened about 1616, and just a couple of years in between is a quavering between two different qualities of time. And the last figure in the Renaissance is Shakespeare, who died in 1616. And the first figures that are there in Puritanism is a debunking of the central core, the pivot of the Renaissance, a debunking of the Hermetic tradition. An intellectual assassin whose name was Casaubon was hired by the Jesuit order to discredit the Hermetic tradition by proving they could not be ancient writings because they have too much Christian influence in them. And his son, Isaac Casaubon's son, Merrick, discredited the last great teacher of the Renaissance, John Dee, and castigated him as a necromancer. trying to learn the language of angels, trying to do all kinds of weird things. And so the Puritanism had an element of a persecution of witchcraft and all occult things as if they were dangerous, whereas the Renaissance had treasured the fact of there being hidden, occult qualities to human beings, and that they were able to touch beyond this world. Not particularly demons, not the demonic, so much as the angelic. And what John Dee was trying to do towards the end of the Renaissance was to learn the angel's language. And that the key to the angel's language was in the book of Enoch. And that somehow all of this was like a secret wisdom, now discredited and went underground again. And it went underground exactly in the same way in the early 17th century that it went underground in the 4th century AD. If you were caught trying to deal outside of the frame of reference of authority, bona fide purity of staying in the frame of reference, you were persecuted by incarceration, frequently by death. This also happened in the 4th century AD, and it happened in 363 AD especially. The head Puritanizing honcho at that time was named Theophilus, and he said, we are having no more paganism, we're having only the formal authority of the Roman Christian Church. We have the power to enforce it, and if you are caught dabbling outside of the lines we have drawn for you, you will be killed. One of the most gracious women to ever live on this planet, whose father was the greatest mathematician of his day. His name was Theon of Smyrna. He was from the Ionic coast of what is today Turkey, was always a part of Greece. Her name was Hypatia. And she taught mathematics and the philosophy that is there in mathematics, the Pythagorean tradition, which in her time was almost 1,000 years old, the Platonic tradition that grew out of the Pythagorean tradition, the Neoplatonic tradition that grew out of not just the Pythagorean and Platonic, but was heavily prismed by the Hermetic tradition. She taught in Alexandria, which was the place in which the great prismatic transform had happened. She was grabbed by her students, stabbed by their styluses, and the flesh was scraped from her bones with oyster shells. When the Puritans took over England, they destroyed the monasteries, they destroyed the churches, they especially cauterized anyone who was caught even looking or glancing outside the frame of reference of authority. And this was exactly at the time where the Renaissance had come. For about 120 years, to the point to where they could send shipfuls of people somewhat safely to the New World. And so the New World began to be a magnet, an attraction for men and women who found that sometimes they couldn't help looking outside the frame of reference because they would dream, or they were talented, that other aspects would occur to them, And they found themselves called upon more and more to become more pure than the Puritans. And when they did so, they found that they had a taste for living ancient purity, ancient lives, going back not to the formal Roman Empire Christianity, now usurped and adopted in England by the English national religion, or in Germany by the national Protestant religion, Lutheranism, Catholicism, that the isms were hemming them in, and they were suffering from a psychic pressure. And what was even worse, they understood that the thought structures were brittle. They were ossifying, they were crumbling, they were chipping away. And what was even more, they were called to be free by their visioning, by their dreams, by the words that they were seeing into, by their thoughts, and finally began to show up in their deeds, which made them suspect. Benjamin Franklin, in his autobiography, records his great-great-grandfather would read the family Bible to the family, which was a crime against the state. You could be killed for reading the Bible to your family. The Bible is read to you by the authorized priests of the religion in authorized places of the religion. You may not do this and not be punished in your own home with your own family. And so there was a trickle of people braving, crossing the Atlantic Ocean, which was tremendous in those days. About 30 years ago, I did a survey of all of the ships that went from Europe to the New World. 90% of the people who went were dead within a few years. They could not survive. The classic case in point is the Pilgrims, leaving from Plymouth, which is on the south coast of England, the Devon coast, collecting people from the Netherlands, collecting people from England, a few people from Germany, a few people from Switzerland, and landing at a site they called Plymouth Rock in Massachusetts. And they all would have died were it not for a couple of the natives of America around Squanto who showed them, you have to prepare for the winter here. You have to grow certain crops like pumpkins and corn, which will be preservable, and you have to have apples and so forth. You have to learn to prepare for life through its cycle, seasonal cycle here, because there is only us to do this. The sparsity, the massive vastness of the land. North America is huge. Its population was minuscule compared to Europe. One of the most poignant visions of how minuscule it was, how living in the United States early on took the blinders off of the frame of reference is in James Fenimore Cooper's The Pathfinder, right away at the beginning of The Pathfinder. Indulge me for reading a little bit We have talked about James Fenimore Cooper last week. We mentioned his great classic book, The American Democrat, first published in 1838. He had come back to the United States in 1833, completely changed. He had gone as a very privileged American. His father owned thousands of acres in upper New York State around Lake Otsego and had founded a village there. It's called Cooperstown. It's where the Baseball Hall of Fame of America is. James Fenimore Cooper's father founded that. He had the prince of the land, noblesse oblige quality to him. And when he was admitted to early Yale, he misbehaved so much that they threw him out. Now, this is a severe thing, to be thrown out of a university when you're supposed to be a prize. I was thrown out of the University of Wisconsin at the age of 19, not for misbehaving, but because I didn't get all A's. They said, how can you get C's with your IQ and your background? You were given a scholarship that paid for everything. You need to sit out for a semester and think this over. Cooper did not sit it out. He went into the United States Navy, which largely at that time, he was born in 1789, largely consisted of training and running ships on the Great Lakes to patrol them, and also on the Atlantic coast to patrol. And Cooper became a great seaman. And later, when he started writing novels, he didn't write until he was in his mid-30s. He had gotten married. He felt himself wealthy enough that he didn't have to really work for a living, but he read a Sir Walter Scott novel, and people said, this is fabulous writing, and Cooper said, anyone can write that kind of a novel. And then someone read him Jane Austen's Persuasion, and that broke the camel's back. He said, I can outwrite Scott, I can outwrite Jane Austen. Her Persuasion is gently mannered and nuanced, but there's more to human beings. Scott writes fantastic historical novels, especially about Arthurian themes, but there's more to events. And so Cooper became one of the world's greatest novelists because he chose as his theme the threshold between Indian America and the new America of the Union, and that the colonial interface was of extraordinary interest, and that what went with the primordial land wilderness of America was the primordial oceanic sphere of the whole world calling for mariners. And so Cooper's works take both hands. They're about the sea and they're about the land. And 5 novels are called the Leatherstocking Saga. It's about men who learned to be white Indians, and at the same time of moving west. And the first one that he wrote in 1823 was called The Pioneers, about how the pioneers were opening up not just the wilderness, but opening the wilderness to transform and become land, to become the United States. But that it took a concomitant opening up so that you stopped being a universally recognized frame of reference, individual of European habits and mind, and you transformed into an American person who had the vision of the land, that it was no longer wilderness that is dangerous, but is expanse that is fertile for transform. It is waiting for you, but that you must enter it in such a way that you are able to transform the European individual of your frame of reference into an American pioneer of a new vision. And that as you did so, you moved further and further away from the magnetic addiction of looking over the Atlantic Ocean for your references, and you began looking to the land further and further west for your references. So one of the kinds of studies you find, this is published by the Finnish Academy of Science and Letters. Quite interesting to be able to have something. The Finnish Academy published this in 1998. And it's entitled James Fenimore Cooper's Landscapes, because the Finns understand landscape. They understand the immense forests, the immensity of the wilderness that extends indefinitely north. It extends into the Arctic and over the world in the Arctic down to the other side, so that they live on the edge of the entirety of the globe all the time. Sibelius's music, testimony to the personality, spirit tones that come out with immensity. Cooper has that in his works. And because it was written in the 1820s beginning, the Pioneers 1823, and it was so successful that he decided that he was going to write a prequel. And so in 1826, he wrote his, I guess it really has become one of the great novels of the world, The Last of the Mohicans. And he followed it up as a sequel to The Pioneers, just as The Last of the Mohicans was the prequel, a sequel in 1827 called The Prairie. It was the final years of his hero, who was called by different names. He's called Leatherstocking, the long rifle. He's called Natty Bumppo, his real name. He's called Hawkeye. He's called, in the fourth of the novels, the Pathfinder. Here's how Cooper wrote The Pathfinder in 1840. He was 51 years old. He had become one of the world's great writers, but he had become a deeper and deeper American visionary. Hermetic America was scintillating in him, because by 1840, the United States had emerged into what was then characterized as the era of good feelings. Not that there were not problems, but the good feelings were that the visionary capacity of Americans is able to explore anywhere that they choose. And they will always find friends who will go with them. And the idea of putting together a companion group of pioneers to go out together, men and women and children and their animals, and find their own way. Here's how it begins. The sublimity connected with vastness, is familiar to every eye. The most abstruse, the most far-reaching, perhaps the most chastened of the poet's thoughts crowd on the imagination as he gazes into the depths of the illimitable void. This is profound. He's not yet talking about what you see phenomenally. He's talking about the vision of what you do not see, but your conscious differentially is primordially real. So let's go back for just a moment to that frame of reference. Thought, word, and deed. Symbol, myth, and ritual. But there's the fourth part of that frame of reference that is not mentioned in thought, word, and deed, and that is nature. Because nature is not a form. It's not a deed. It's not the collection of deeds. It's not a thought. It's not the collection of the structures of thought. And it's not words, the process of the language, the feelings, the images. Nature is a field like consciousness. It is a field out of which the four dimensions can occur. In fact, occur all the time. They occur all of the time because they begin with the emergence of time as an energy. An energy is a frequency. A frequency has its ups and downs of its vibratory coming through. And so time is the first dimension that occurs, and out of time instantly the three dimensions of space blossom, so that the four-dimensional time-space phenomenal world and its referential integral, the mind, and its process in between, language, images, feelings, but the field in which they occur is the field of nature, which is real before it's phenomenal. It's real before there's an existence, before things happen, before actions form sets of doing. So that the great ancient wisdom, the Hermetic wisdom, was that nature must be not counted, but recognized, and so one can express it as zero. Whereas existence is the one. And one of the great flaws of people who are superficial, who are artificial, who are world ignorant, so-called proud, and full of authority, they say that one is the beginning of counting, whereas the Hermetic tradition says zero is the beginning of accounting. And that when you have thought, word, and deed, you have an unspoken field of reality which births the energies of actuality. And so one has to be able to go back not just to the simplicity, the purity of oneness, one has to go below. In Philo of Alexandria's On the Contemplative Life, written about 14 AD, when he was an eyewitness to Jesus as a young man teaching in Alexandria, as the president of the healers, the therapeutai, a famous quote from Philo is that in the silence of the silence, when the speaker's language engraved itself on the inner part of the mind, they began to realize there is something purer than the monad, something better than the good, something more primordially there to spawn the one, the good, the one and the many, the good and the evil, and that all of this comes from a field of mystery. That nature is a field of mystery, just as consciousness then is a field of mystique. The French mystique is the right word to use. One of the great writers at the beginning of the 20th century in France, Lucien Lévy-Bruhl, was trying to penetrate and understand how primordial man, primitive man, thought. And he realized that the phrase is that they participated mystically in nature. Participation mystique. And in doing so, they were able then to bring what they did, their physicality of who they were in their body, not out of itself in its oneness, but out of the primordiality of the zero field of nature. And so they became fresh again at every iteration of their energy. And that their vibrations then were original. Their bodily existence was not an existence of a frame of reference, but came out of the mystery before the frame of reference even occurs. Primordial peoples, like the Australian Aborigines, speckle what they are about with little white dots everywhere. And they'll speckle their body with little white dots. American Indians also treat their body in exactly this way. This body has emerged out of the natural zero field primordially. And so we are fresh at every micro instant that we are, because we only now have just emerged as we are. So there is nothing stale whatsoever. Everything is vibrant and alive. And the American landscape was peppered by the red dots of the primordial Americans everywhere that Europeans transforming into Americans began to explore. And James Fenimore Cooper was the first great visionary to explore the world of the European transforming into a white Indian, like in our time in the 1940s and the early 1950s. Norman Mailer explored what it was like for the first time to become a white Negro. And the beat movement of the 40s and 50s is a resonance of what James Fenimore Cooper was writing about at the beginning of the 19th century. Let's take a little break. Let's return back to immediately the concern that we have at this time in the 21st century. We're at the farther cusp of a threshold that began to occur as a bow shock in 1991. That bow shock threshold is usually about a generation. So it means that the feeling tone of metaphysicians is that somehow 2012 is going to be a catastrophic year of change. The deeper wisdom understanding is that this is not a 20-year generation. The generations in ancient times were more like 25 years. And one can look for 2016 to be an extraordinary transform. Not a cutoff so much, but as a trigger to a new time form era that has already begun. The premonitions, visionarily, come about 300 years before. 300 years before Jesus is remarkably the time of Alexander the Great. And 300 years before our time now is Benjamin Franklin. In the time form of Solomon, King Solomon, 1000 BC, Moses was about 300 years before him. In the time of Abraham, Sargon the Great of Akkad was about 300 years before his time. So that you have parallel sets of time forms that occur. And to be able to understand the overlay of such large strategic qualities, you need to have a referential that is from the pivot. And the pivot is that higher dimensional spirit person. That higher dimensional spirit person is the central core of a historical set that has a referential to the future and to the largest context that is real. The largest context that is real in ancient wisdom put into Greek, which we use today, is the cosmos. And it is the study of the cosmos that is cosmology. And so cosmology is extremely powerful. And the spirit person core is the transformer of the whole frame of reference that bases itself on existence, on physicality, on what is. And that transforming quality of what is, in classical Hermetic language, is alchemy. Ancient Egypt was Chem, the land of Chem. Alchemy, chemistry. Cosmology is largely astronomy, misunderstood by the popularizing mentality of the world as astrology. This is not the case. It is not astrology. It is cosmology, and it is astronomy. One of the 9 muses in the set of wisdom teachers, women, the feminine wisdom patrons of the arts, there was a muse of astronomy, not a muse of astrology. We must not mistake this. The set of the 9 muses together, held by Apollo in terms of the ancient mythological designation, is a set of 10. But that set of 10, which is about astronomy and not astrology, has in our time had a deeper transform, like alchemy had a deeper transform and became chemistry. And though the beginnings of chemistry as a science, so that the art of alchemy became the science of chemistry, began to happen in the 1500s, in the 16th century, and reached an apex when the balance between alchemy and chemistry was at a threshold where they were just about even. The emergence of chemistry was as important as the sophistication of alchemy, and the figure that looms at that threshold most profoundly is Robert Boyle. And his writings on chemistry are the first time that one gets a wisdom tradition in terms of the deepening of the Hermetic heritage into a Hermetic science, which chemistry progressively became. The transform of astronomy came at the end of the 19th century and the beginnings of the 20th century. The Hermetic ancient wisdom art of astronomy deepened into the science of astrophysics. And with astrophysics, one can take a look at the analytic of the carrier of electromagnetic energy, light, the photon, and its interreaction finally becomes apparent that, well, the photon interreacting with electrons gives us a way of understanding how the chemical elements that are made by atomic structure and mediated and given their membranic shape and size and structure by electrons, now with astrophysics, one can investigate this. And by the early 21st century, we are able to investigate one photon at a time, one electron at a time. The first time the photon was able to be recognized astrophysically as a particle was 1923 by Albert Einstein. 100 years exactly before that is James Fenimore Cooper's first novel, The Pioneers. There is a particular thing in Hermetic America that we will observe and see because the developer of astrophysics was a great American astronomer. And Hale not only began astrophysics, he was the first editor of the Astrophysical Journal, which is still published today. One of the most distinguished scientific journals on the planet. Very expensive. But if you go to a major library, university library, and see any issue of Astrophysical Journal, you will see the cutting edge of scientific analytic in terms of cosmology, in terms of astronomy, in terms of astrophysics. But cosmology and alchemy were joined by a third, always in the Hermetic tradition, and that third is philosophy. To become a philosopher is to become a lover of wisdom. The feminine wisdom is loved, is beloved. And she, like a feminine muse, returns that love not as a physical love, not as a mental love, not as a mythic love, but as a visionary love that has spiritual, numinal, jewel-like, transformative lenses. One comes in possession of the jewels of wisdom. and realizes that what you do is that you make sure that you transform your mind so that it is the correct setting, the bezel, for the jewel of numinous insight lensing, so that the diamond ring now is not just for a physical marriage or a symbolic marriage with mythic language mediating in between, but becomes a numinous form of a spiritual marriage, a marriage of the spirits. And the fertility of that is borne out in the language of history. And it isn't just that great men make history, it's that spiritual persons generate history. And so history is a very high level process that is the transform of the mythic process. Just as art is the transform of the ritual, and science is a transform of just the symbolic, history is the transform of the mythic. Now the language refines itself and has more dimensions than myth. Myth is a four-dimensional stream. History is a seven-dimensional stream. It is kaleidoscopic. It's not just a stream. It's an entire delta, a complex of streams that work together and create an ecology. The first person to understand that there is a stream in the ocean was Benjamin Franklin. He discovered the Gulf Stream patiently, because he was always after what he had been acclimated to, a whole Enlightenment era perspective that one can learn by experiment and observation, and in doing so, one can, if one refines oneself into a spirit person prism, you can learn to see deeper into and farther out from the physical actuality, because you're going outside of the mental confines of a frame of reference. You can see something new both outside of it and penetratively deeper inside of it. And when such a person, such a personality, in possession of that jeweled ring of the spirit marriage that has a resonant harmonic with the cosmos, one learns to see nature in a new way. And the landscape now becomes a scintillating book, as it were, of natural history. And so one sees the emergence all of a sudden towards the apex of the Enlightenment in Benjamin Franklin's time, at the time of the young Jefferson, of savants understanding there is everything to know about nature that we don't know. We have been alive for who knows how long here. We're now seeing it for the very first time as it actually is, as what it was, as what it can be. And one of the prizes that Jefferson had in his early days as third president of the United States was a skeleton of a prehistoric animal that had obviously lived much more anciently than the biblical Adam of just 4004 BC. And the first really deep understanding of that was Benjamin Franklin, noticing that the coal fields in Pennsylvania run in such a way, and that coal fields and all other kinds of geologic deposits are much more ancient than even animal life, so that obviously the world has been here who knows how many millions of years. And it wasn't until Lyell's Principles of Geology in the middle of the 1840s in England, a 2-volume book that Darwin read with great interest. Lyell's Principles of Geology showed it is hundreds of millions of years, and he wrote a little book that went with it called On the Antiquity of Man, written about 50 years after Benjamin Franklin's death, written about 20 years after Jefferson's death, and written at a time when, at their apex, were Hermetic Americans like Thoreau and Emerson. And Thoreau's founding of the patient wisdom penetration, the patient wisdom vibratory expansion, so that one looked at the book of nature as a tutor of oneself. The first seeds of that, he and his brother John used to collect Indian arrowheads around Concord, Massachusetts. And they had huge collections. And many American boys of that era, the 1820s as boys, would find Indian arrowheads everywhere. There were millions of them. The Indians had been there a lot longer than a few thousand years. And so in the 1830s, a man named Walter Pidgeon, not the actor, this is the 1830s, found an old Fox Indian sachem, a holy man, named De Kuda, who took Pidgeon around to thousands upon thousands of American Indian mounds and told him how to read the mounds. There were some that were animal effigies, some that were symbolic, geometric effigies. There were mystery effigies. And he published a book, and I will bring it next week, a first edition. It's the only edition. De Kuda's revealing of ancient America. And he told Pidgeon, he said, the entire American landscape, all of it, from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, was tattooed by the thousands and thousands and thousands of years of American Indian wisdom. And that the largest focus of the American Indian mounds was on the Mississippi River, right across from where St. Louis is today. Cahokia was an American Indian metropolis that had 50,000 people in it. About 1,500 years ago. And if you stand on the highest of the pyramid mounds of Cahokia, you can look out across the Illinois landscape to the Mississippi River and across the Mississippi River in a diagonal, and you can see dominating the waterfront of St. Louis the Jefferson Arch, about 600-700 feet high, the gateway to the west. It is a mark of Hermetic America to be able to understand deeply that there is an inner transform to the lens of your spirit person, so that the kaleidoscopic field of vision comes into play in a historical way. And that it isn't just the ritual actions of what you do, it's the transforms of what you're doing to bring out of nature a fresh newness of existence, of existentials that would not have happened otherwise. Everything is new under the sun. And to share, to link up with other men, to link up with other women who are able to do this as well, so that that community now together are like a choir, where it isn't just you singing solo, but now there's a choir singing, and one gets a magisterial grandeur to it. And that one can expand that choir to include an entire people. Jefferson once wrote, he said, "We have always had in history men and women who have learned to become free, and occasionally whole communities of people. We're going to have an American experiment to see what happens if you have millions of men and women who are free, and whatever they will do together will be worthwhile." So we should not shackle them with frames of reference that are out of date. He used a Latin phrase, and it means, in legal terms, the world belongs to the living. His computation was closer to ours, that a generation is about 20 years, so that every 19 years, everything should be worked out from scratch again. Not from scratch, from the field of nature and the field of vision, working in a complementarity, and whatever those men and women decide how their lives are going to be lived, they should have the freedom to do this and not be inheritors of the dead. Life does not belong to those who are dead. Not only are those empires over, those frames of reference are over, and even deeper, the Hermetic wisdom is monumentally accurate. When the time forms change, all of the time forms that are gone now, all of their forms are no longer operative. So that you are living not only under the clutch of voodoo zombies who are gone, but you're living an illusion of artificiality that stinks to the cosmos. Yeah, Zorba the Greek, one time, it was Kakionis carried it over into the film with Anthony Quinn. He says to his boss, Alan Bates, the young man who's been a prig most of his life with his books, and Zorba's trying to get him out. He says, "One thing God will not permit: if a woman calls a man to her bed and he will not go, then you have trouble, boss." It is that life is to be shared, to be real, and to be lived in a multidimensional way, and that the proofing of it is that the historical kaleidoscopic consciousness that is engendered by that people will have a cosmic harmonic to it. The harmony of the world is a resonance that it is real to the cosmos. Now, this is a peculiar quality that comes out in art. We left off with James Fenimore Cooper's The Pathfinder. Let's go to a book that came out in 1860, the year that Abraham Lincoln won the presidency, just before the beginning of the Civil War. About 9 years after Cooper died in 1851, his daughter Susan collected excerpts and engravings, a lot of color engravings, and she put this out. And she says in her preface, "The earlier works of every national literature must always possess an interest peculiar to themselves. The interest an interest which may even to a certain degree be independent of any merit of their own, and naturally connected with the period to which they belong. There could be nothing, of course, of the peculiar charm of remote time connected with any work dating with the present century. If in the quaint ballad, the rude chronicle of early English writing, the figures all move, as it were, amid the long shadows of the dawn, thrown into high and picturesque relief by the morning light, we're prepared for something far less striking and peculiar in the form of any literature coming into being in the noontide of full civilization. Still, there will always be something of a peculiar movement and coloring connected with the first intellectual work of every independent people, like a Homer. Something which gives claim to a degree of a special attention to the earlier volumes of every national library, however brilliant may be those which fill succeeding shelves. And while a dozen years of American history at this period of time affect the changes which have required centuries with older nations, the fact gives already to works of the last 50 years something of the interest of a past condition of existence. The writings of Mr. James Fenimore Cooper, by their date and their spirit, must always hold this position to the American reader. She is beautifully able to illumine the last of the Leatherstocking saga, the Deerslayer. What began with the pioneers and then went back to the pioneers is said about 1793. The last of the Mohegans goes back to 1757. And the Prairie takes it into the 1800s. The old Deerslayer, the old Pathfinder, the old Hawkeye, is in his 80s. And he's dying alone out on the American prairies to the west of the Mississippi. And the last word that he says to God, here, answering the call, here, he's been called. One pleasant summer evening, writes Susan Fenimore Cooper, at the beginning, right after he finished the Pathfinder, and he was ready to retire from the Leatherstocking saga, and they were driving in a carriage along Lake Otsego, outside of what today is Cooperstown. One pleasant summer evening, the author of the Pathfinder was driving along the lake shore in his farm wagon, singing cheerily as he passed over that quiet, shady road, as he frequently did. Though no musician, he often sang when in a gay mood. Snatches of familiar songs that had struck his fancy. He would have loved iTunes. And many a time when driving along the quiet, shady road leading to his mountain farm, the squirrel at play or the sleepy teamster dozing on his seat has been surprised by a sudden burst of Burns, Scott's Wahay Wallace Bled, or Moore's Love's Young Dream, especially favorites with him. On the present occasion, however, it was a political song that he was singing. And shall we avow the act of infidelity, an electioneering song of the party opposed to his own? He liked the tune of his political opponent's song, and so he was singing it. Suddenly he paused, as an opening in the wood revealed a sweet view of the lake. His spirited gray eye rested a moment on the water, with that expression of abstracted, poetical thought, visioning, ever familiar to those that lived with him. Then turning to the companion at his side, the daughter now writing these lines, he exclaimed, I must write one more book, dearie, about our little lake. Again, his eye rested on the water and the banks with a far-seeing look of one evoking imaginary figures to fill the beautiful scene, the visionary landscape. A moment of silence followed, his daughter being unwilling to interrupt the train of thought opening before him. A few minutes passed. Again, he cracked his whip, resumed his song with some careless chat on little incidents of the hour, and drove homeward. A few days later, the first pages of The Deerslayer were written. What is the first paragraph of the first pages of The Deerslayer? On the human imagination, events produce the effects of time. Thus, he who has traveled far and seen much is apt to fancy he has lived long, and the history that most abounds in important incidents soonest assumes the aspect of antiquity. In no other way can we account for the venerable air that is already gathering around American annals. When the mind reverts to the earliest days of colonial history, the period seems remote and obscure. The thousand changes that thicken along the links of recollections, throwing back the origin of the nation to a day so distant as seemingly to reach the mists of time. And yet 4 lives of ordinary duration would suffice to transmit from mouth to mouth in the form of a tradition all that civilized man has achieved within the limits of the Republic. What's happened is that the Hermetic heritage has blossomed fully into a garden by the 1840s in America. It happens like this. When you have a closed mind, your closed mind is within that frame of reference. The only way to prepare it to transform is to not look at it as a frame of reference, but rather to shift your balance so that instead of your balance being in terms of the referential frame, your balance is in terms of the center of attentiveness to the entirety of the frame. So I call it a square of attention in my education. And we'll see next week that a new education is the time-honored beginning of a new era of wisdom. When you shift a frame of reference to a square of attention, now the pivot of attention is not in terms of the frame's reference, but in terms of the seer. Instead of looking at something, one is aware of you are looking at. And seeing now is a function of the seer, the seer. It's a function of the field of wisdom, which is the field of vision. One now has engendered by, in magic, they call it sleight of hand. This is sleight of integral. You now are looking in such a way that from the center of the field is no longer a square. The field is a circle. And that circle now is only one transform away from being a sphere. When Benjamin Franklin was first working on electricity, and he's the first one in the world to be able to understand that you can put Leyden jars together in rows, in orders, and make a battery. The first electric battery in the world. He first called it the electrical circle. Then, within a couple of years, he understood that it is not a circle and changed it and was the first in the world to use the language that we still use today. It's an electrical circuit. That electrical circuit of four-dimensional space-time always follows the circuit. And however you put it together, it doesn't have to be in a circle. It can be any which way. That circuit will work. You turn the switch, the circuit works. How does it work? It can be put to work, it can be put to use visionarily in completely new ways. It isn't just that it's a circuit that works, it's a circuit you can put to work for your new purposes. This is a catastrophic transform. At the same time that Franklin was doing this, in 1 year, he envisioned the academy in Philadelphia that became the University of Pennsylvania. He made the first fire insurance company. And he did a number of other improvements in Philadelphia, all within a couple of years. At the same time, he was understanding it's a circuit. And that means energy universally flows in circuits, and you can connect it and make new forms that are energized, and they will work. Hermetic America. More next week.